golden splendor of the royal court, Eleanor's dream became her greatest humiliation. "You will spend the wedding night alone." The king's words cut through her like a blade, leaving her abandoned in a marriage bed meant for two. What cruel secret could drive a man to reject his bride before all the kingdom? As whispers spread and courtiers mock her failure, Eleanor discovers something unexpected in the king's eyes. Not disgust, but pain. Behind his rejection lies a blood oath made to a dying woman, a vow so powerful it has imprisoned them both in a cage of honor and loneliness. But when the object of the king's 5-year hunt suddenly emerges from the shadows, Eleanor must decide. Will she accept her gilded prison of solitude, or risk everything to free the man who rejected her from the chains of his own making? The smell of burning wax filled the stone corridors as nobles lined the walls, their eyes glittering with malice beneath feigned smiles. Eleanor's heart hammered against her chest so violently she feared the elaborately stitched bodice might tear. Just yesterday she had been nothing, a miller's daughter with flour-dusted hands and simple dreams. Today, the weight of a golden crown pressed against her temples, foreign and cold against her skin that had only known the warmth of summer sun in the fields. King William entered the great hall with purposeful strides, his crimson cloak billowing behind him like blood spilled across marble. Every unmarried woman in the kingdom had dreamed of becoming his bride, yet he had chosen her, plain, common Eleanor, for reasons that still remained shrouded in whispers and speculation. The crowd parted before him as waves before the bow of a ship, while Eleanor stood frozen, a rabbit sensing the shadow of a hawk. When he reached for her hand, his fingers were surprisingly warm, but his eyes remained distant, as if looking through her rather than at her. "My queen," he announced, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. The words should have filled her with joy, but something in his tone, a subtle hollowness, sent a chill slithering down her spine. The banquet that followed blurred into a cacophony of forced laughter and clinking goblets. Servants scurried between tables bearing platters of roasted meats and sweet pastries, their eyes occasionally darting toward Eleanor with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The Countess of Blackmere, with her raven hair and lips painted blood red, leaned close to the Duke beside her, whispering something that made him snort wine through his nose. They both glanced at Eleanor, then quickly looked away when she caught their gaze. "They say he chose her to appease the commoners," a voice drifted from behind a column. "The kingdom needs stability after the rebellion, or perhaps to secure the loyalty of the eastern provinces," another replied. "Her father's mill sits on contested lands." Eleanor's throat constricted as she forced herself to sip from her goblet. The wine tasted of ash in her mouth. She had known there would be cruelty, had prepared herself for the sideways glances and whispered insults. What she hadn't prepared for was the loneliness that pressed against her chest like a stone, even amid hundreds of people. Or the way King William, her husband of mere hours, seemed to hold himself apart from her, a carefully measured distance between them, even when seated side by side. As twilight descended, the torches cast elongated shadows across the floor. Ladies-in-waiting approached with reverent steps, their eyes downcast as they surrounded Eleanor. The bedding ceremony, the tradition she had dreaded most. She felt their hands upon her, removing the crown, unfastening the ornate dress that had been sewn by the kingdom's finest tailors. Each layer removed felt like armor being stripped away, leaving her vulnerable in ways she had never imagined. They led her through corridors that twisted and turned, up winding stairs to the royal bedchamber where perfumed candles burned in golden holders. The sheets had been turned down, sprinkled with dried rose petals and lavender. A flagon of wine and 2 goblets waited on a small table by the window. Outside, a full moon hung low in the sky, casting silver light across the land that was now, in name at least, partly hers. "Your Majesty will join you shortly," the eldest of the ladies murmured before they all departed, closing the heavy wooden door behind them. Eleanor stood alone in her thin shift, gooseflesh rising on her arms despite the warmth from the hearth. She touched the silk sheets, finer than anything she had ever known, and wondered if this was real or some strange dream from which she would awaken to find herself back in her father's modest home. Footsteps in the corridor made her heart leap to her throat. She straightened her back, trying to remember the hastily given instructions on how a queen should behave on her wedding night. The door swung open, and King William entered, having exchanged his ceremonial robes for simpler attire. Without the crown and royal regalia, he appeared younger, the lines of worry less pronounced on his face. For one breathless moment, their eyes truly met for the first time. Something flickered across his features. Pain, regret, before his expression hardened once more. "My queen," he said, his voice softer than before, almost gentle. Eleanor took a hesitant step toward him, hope fluttering in her chest like a caged bird. "My king." He remained by the door, his knuckles white where he gripped the handle. "I must speak plainly with you." The flutter in her chest turned to a sinking weight. "Yes?" "This marriage was necessary for the realm's stability," he said, each word measured and precise. "I chose you because your character is spoken of highly among your people. You are known to be kind and just." "Thank you," she whispered, though gratitude was not what she felt as the distance between them seemed to widen with each passing heartbeat. "But I must tell you now, before false hope takes root." He paused, drawing a deep breath as if gathering courage. "You will pass this wedding night alone." The words hung in the air between them, sharp as daggers. Eleanor felt them pierce her chest one by one, though she remained standing somehow, as the room tilted sickeningly around her. "Have I displeased you already?" she managed, her voice barely audible. "No." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "This is not about you. There are obligations I must honor, promises made that cannot be broken, even for a queen." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. Not of sorrow for lost passion. She had never expected love from this arrangement, but for the public humiliation that would follow. Everyone would know. The whispers would become shouts. The queen, rejected on her wedding night. King William's hand lifted for a moment, appearing as if he might wipe away her tears, but then dropped back to his side. "I am sorry," he said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "More than you can know." He turned and walked out, closing the door firmly behind him. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed down the corridor, fading until only silence remained. Eleanor sank to the floor, her legs no longer able to support her. The silk of her shift pooled around her like water as sobs racked her body. Outside the window she could hear the continued celebrations, the laughter and music a cruel counterpoint to her solitude. By morning, the entire castle would know of the king's rejection. The nobles who had looked upon her with barely concealed disdain would now openly mock her failure. The servants would pity her, and she would have to face them all with her head held high, a crown upon her brow that suddenly felt like the heaviest burden imaginable. As the candles burned lower, casting grotesque shadows on the walls, a single question echoed in Eleanor's mind, growing louder with each passing moment until it drowned out all other thoughts. Why? Morning light crept through the stained glass windows, painting fractured rainbows across Eleanor's tear-stained face. She had not slept. How could she, when her world had shattered with 7 simple words? The rumpled bedsheets beside her remained untouched, a pristine monument to her rejection. Outside her chamber, she could already hear the hushed voices of servants, their tones carrying that unmistakable pitch of gossip being passed along like currency. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she splashed cold water on her face from the silver basin. The girl who stared back from the polished mirror was unrecognizable. Dark circles beneath red-rimmed eyes, her complexion ashen despite the golden crown that would soon rest upon her head again. She practiced a smile, watching how it failed to reach her eyes. It would have to do. A gentle knock preceded the entrance of her ladies-in-waiting. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but Eleanor caught the quick, furtive glances they exchanged. They knew. Of course they knew. In a castle, walls didn't just have ears. They had mouths that whispered and eyes that missed nothing. "Your Majesty," the eldest, Lady Matilda, curtsied deeply. "The king requests your presence at the morning feast." Something in the way her voice softened on the word king made Eleanor's stomach clench. As they dressed her in layers of blue silk and silver embroidery, Eleanor forced herself to breathe slowly, methodically. Each breath counted, each moment survived was a small victory. The crown, when placed upon her head, felt heavier than yesterday. "You look radiant, Your Majesty," Lady Matilda said, though her eyes held something that looked suspiciously like pity. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "I believe I'm ready now." The walk to the great hall stretched like a road to execution. Servants paused in their duties to bow or curtsy, eyes flicking up to study her face before quickly dropping back to the floor. A pair of guards standing at attention by a corner exchanged glances as she passed, one suppressing what might have been a smirk. The stone beneath her slippers seemed to pitch and roll like the deck of a ship in storm. The great hall fell eerily silent as she entered. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her, searching for signs of the humiliation they had undoubtedly heard whispered about since dawn. Eleanor felt a cold sweat break out across her back, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. At the high table, King William sat already, his expression unreadable as he watched her approach. The seat beside him, her seat, waited empty and exposed. As she crossed the vast expanse of floor, a noblewoman to her right leaned toward her companion, whispering behind a bejeweled hand. The words weren't meant to reach Eleanor, yet somehow cut through the silence with crystal clarity. Poor thing. Not woman enough to keep the king in her bed even one night. Suppressed laughter rippled through nearby courtiers. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on the high table, counting each step. 17, 18, 19. The journey seemed endless. When she finally reached her chair, King William rose, a courtesy that surprised the court into another wave of whispers. He offered no smile, no words of greeting, yet there was something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. A flash of, was it respect? It disappeared so quickly she couldn't be certain. "My queen," he said simply, his voice carrying across the now silent hall. "My king," she responded, taking her seat as gracefully as her trembling legs would allow. Servants began bringing platters of food, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, honey-glazed fruits, roasted meats. Eleanor's stomach rebelled at the thought of eating, but she forced herself to take small bites, aware of the scrutiny she faced. To her left, a group of young noblewomen huddled together, occasionally glancing her way before dissolving into barely concealed laughter. "I hear she smells of flour and pig swill," one said, not bothering to lower her voice. No wonder he couldn't bear to touch her. Eleanor's hand tightened around her goblet, knuckles whitening. A drop of wine spilled over the rim, staining the pristine tablecloth crimson, the color of shame, of humiliation. She set the goblet down carefully, wiping her fingers on her napkin with deliberate slowness. Through it all, the king remained silent beside her, eating methodically, his profile as rigid and unyielding as the castle walls. Yet there was something odd about his demeanor. He avoided looking at her directly, yet when she glanced at him from the corner of her eye, she caught him watching her, his expression troubled. Once, when a particularly cruel jest reached their table, she noticed his jaw tighten, a muscle twitching beneath the skin. There was a story there, a tale untold. Eleanor's thoughts raced, momentarily distracted from her humiliation. What was it Lady Matilda had said when preparing her for court life? In politics, nothing is as it seems, and every action has purpose beyond what is visible. Was there purpose in her rejection? Something beyond mere disdain? As the feast dragged on, Eleanor noticed another peculiarity. The king's right hand, usually steady and precise in movement, occasionally trembled when he reached for his goblet. Once their fingers brushed accidentally as they both reached for the salt cellar, and she felt him flinch, not in disgust, but as if the contact caused him pain. These observations kindled a tiny spark within her chest. Not hope exactly, but curiosity. A mystery to unravel. A puzzle piece that didn't fit the narrative being whispered throughout the court. "Your Majesty," a voice interrupted her thoughts. The royal chamberlain stood before the high table, bowing deeply. "The delegation from Northminster has arrived. They await your pleasure in the council chambers." King William nodded, rising from his seat. He hesitated, then turned to Eleanor. "Would you care to join us, my queen? Your perspective may prove valuable." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Queens were ornaments, not advisors. Eleanor felt the weight of hundreds of shocked stares. "I would be honored," she replied, fighting to keep the surprise from her voice. As they walked together through the great hall, leaving stunned silence in their wake, Eleanor sensed the shift in the air, confusion replacing mockery. She kept her eyes forward, her posture regal, though inside, questions multiplied like stars appearing in a darkening sky. In the corridor outside, away from prying eyes, the king slowed his pace. For a brief moment, the mask of royal indifference slipped. "You held yourself with dignity," he said quietly. Few could have endured such cruelty with such grace. Before she could respond, his expression hardened once more, and he quickened his stride. Eleanor hurried to keep pace, her mind reeling. In those few words lay neither the scorn of a disgusted husband nor the coldness of an indifferent monarch, but something altogether different, something that resembled respect. As they approached the council chambers, Eleanor made a silent vow. She would solve the riddle of this man who was her husband, yet not her husband. Behind his rejection lay secrets, and behind those secrets, perhaps, lay truth. She would find it, no matter the cost. Because in that moment, as the great doors swung open before them, Eleanor realized something that transformed her shame into strength. The king hadn't looked at her with hatred or repulsion, he had looked at her with pain. And pain, unlike hatred, always had a source. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding, and Eleanor had become intimately acquainted with the architecture of her gilded cage. She knew which corridor tiles echoed beneath her slippers, which tapestries concealed draughts, which servants averted their eyes in pity rather than contempt. The castle had transformed into a labyrinth of whispers that followed her like persistent shadows, growing louder when she turned corners, falling silent when she entered rooms. "She sleeps alone every night," came the whispers behind cupped hands. "The king hasn't visited her chambers even once. Perhaps she's cursed. My cousin's friend knows a woman who—" Eleanor had learned to walk with her chin lifted, her steps measured and deliberate, as if each footfall declared, "I hear you, and I remain unbroken." But in the solitude of her chambers, she often pressed her forehead against cold stone walls, wondering if she would ever feel anything but this aching hollowness again. This particular morning, she stood by her window, watching raindrops race down the leaded glass. Beyond the castle walls, the town awakened, bakers with flour-dusted hands opening their shops, fishermen hauling their catches to market, children splashing through puddles. A normal world continuing while hers remained suspended in uncertainty. A knock at her door announced Lady Matilda, who had become her most trusted lady-in-waiting, perhaps the only one who didn't participate in the court's cruel gossip. "Your Majesty," Matilda said, her voice low and urgent. "You requested information about the king's habits." Eleanor turned sharply from the window. "You've discovered something?" The older woman glanced nervously toward the door. "He visits the chapel every night, Your Majesty. After the castle sleeps. I followed at a distance, as you asked." She hesitated. "He stays for hours, sometimes until dawn breaks." "Praying?" Eleanor asked, her mind racing with possibilities. "I believe so. Always alone, with no guards permitted inside." Matilda stepped closer, lowering her voice further. "And there's something else. The king's manservant. I persuaded him to share a flagon of wine last evening. He mentioned that His Majesty suffers from terrible nightmares. He cries out in his sleep. Something about a vow and atonement." Eleanor's heart quickened. A vow. The word echoed in her mind, connecting to fragments of memory. The king's words on their wedding night about promises that couldn't be broken. "Thank you, Matilda. You've been invaluable." After her lady departed, Eleanor paced her chamber, piecing together this new information with her own observations. The king's avoidance, the pain in his eyes, the nightly vigils in the chapel, they formed a pattern she couldn't yet decipher, but one that suggested his rejection wasn't born of disdain. That afternoon, Eleanor ventured into parts of the castle she had previously avoided: servants' passages, guard quarters, the kitchens where gossip flowed as freely as ale. She carried a basket of small gifts, ribbons for the chambermaids, sweet pastries for the guards, coin for the stable boys, ostensibly royal generosity. But each offering came with carefully crafted questions. "Does the king often ride alone?" she asked the head groom, who bowed deeply as he accepted a silver piece. "Aye, your majesty, every 7th day at dawn, takes the same path toward the monastery at St. Michael's Mount, returns by midday, always troubled in spirit, if you don't mind my saying." In the laundry, Eleanor complimented the head washerwoman on her fine work, presenting her with a new headscarf. "Such dedication deserves recognition," she said warmly. "I imagine the king's linens require special attention?" The woman's weathered face brightened at the recognition. "Indeed, your majesty. Especially after his campaigns. Those battle wounds left terrible scars, begging your pardon for speaking of such matters." Scars. Another piece of the puzzle. Eleanor filed the information away carefully. By dusk, she had collected dozens of fragments, some surely exaggerations, others possibly truths. The king had led a victorious campaign against northern invaders 5 years prior. He had once saved a village from bandits, fighting alongside common folk rather than commanding from safety. He visited orphanages with no heralds announcing his charity. And most intriguingly, he had once been betrothed to another, a fact mentioned by the wine steward, who immediately fell silent when he realized what he'd revealed. As twilight deepened into night, Eleanor found herself drawn to the great hall, now empty save for servants clearing the remains of supper. She walked its length slowly, studying the ancient tapestries depicting the kingdom's history. Near the far end hung the newest edition, a battle scene showing King William leading his forces against northern raiders. The artist had captured his determination, his courage, but not the complexity Eleanor had glimpsed beneath his mask. "An impressive victory," came a voice from behind her, "though the tapestry tells only half the tale." Eleanor turned to find Lord Barrister, the elderly master of arms, approaching with slow, measured steps. His lined face bore the evidence of countless battles, but his eyes remained sharp and observant. "What half does it omit, my lord?" she asked carefully. The old warrior studied her for a long moment. "The cost, your majesty. Every triumph demands payment." He nodded toward the tapestry. "The king saved many that day, but not all who deserved saving." Before Eleanor could press further, voices echoed from the corridor, counselors approaching, deep in discussion. Lord Barrister bowed stiffly and departed, leaving her with yet another cryptic piece to her growing collection. Later that night, unable to sleep, Eleanor wrapped herself in a dark cloak and slipped from her chambers. The corridors were nearly deserted, with only occasional guards standing sentry, who bowed as she passed, asking no questions of their queen's midnight wanderings. She found herself drawn to the chapel, wondering if the king maintained his vigil even now. The massive wooden doors stood slightly ajar, a thin line of candlelight escaping into the corridor. Eleanor hesitated, her hand hovering over the carved surface. To intrude on his private devotions would be bold, perhaps reckless. Yet how else would she uncover the truth? Before she could decide, voices drifted from within, not one, but two. The king was not alone. "You cannot continue this penance forever, your majesty," said an aged, raspy voice she recognized as Father Thomas, the royal chaplain. "The kingdom needs an heir. Your queen deserves—" "I know what she deserves," the king interrupted, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "More than anyone I know. But the vow was made in blood, Father, before God and the saints. Until justice is done, until I fulfill my promise to her. It has been 5 years," the chaplain said gently. "Would she want this? Your life bound by guilt, the kingdom's future jeopardized?" "She has no voice to tell us what she would want," came the king's bitter reply. "That was taken from her, along with everything else, because I failed." Eleanor pressed closer to the door, her heart pounding so loudly she feared they might hear it. Who was this she they spoke of? What promise bound the king so completely that he would deny himself, and her, a true marriage? Just then, her foot caught on the edge of her cloak. She stumbled, causing the door to creak. Instantly the voices fell silent. "Someone is there," the king said sharply. Eleanor turned and fled, her slippers nearly silent on the stone floor as she raced back toward her chambers. Behind her, she heard the chapel door swing open fully, but she had already rounded the corner, her dark cloak melting into the shadows. Back in her room, breath coming in gasps, she leaned against the closed door. Her mind whirled with what she'd overheard. A vow made in blood, a promise unfulfilled, a loss that haunted him still, 5 years later. The pieces were beginning to align, forming a picture both clearer and more complex than the court gossip suggested. Her rejection wasn't born of disdain or disgust. It stemmed from something deeper, more painful, a wound that had never healed, a guilt that bound him as surely as any chain. As she lay in her solitary bed, Eleanor made a decision. She would no longer be simply a victim of circumstance, an ornament rejected without explanation. She would uncover the full truth, not just for herself, but for the troubled man who was her husband in name only. And perhaps, in understanding his pain, she might find a way to heal them both. A month had passed since Eleanor's nighttime discovery at the chapel, and the weight of unspoken words had grown almost unbearable. Each morning she watched the king at breakfast, studying the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Each evening at supper, she noticed how he barely touched his wine, as if fearing what truths might escape his lips if he indulged. Between these moments stretched a silence vast as an ocean, with both of them drowning on opposite shores. The court continued its whispers, though they'd grown more subdued. Eleanor's dignified demeanor and the king's occasional public courtesies toward her had dampened the most salacious gossip. Still, the fundamental truth remained unchanged. The royal marriage existed on parchment alone. On this particular evening, a fierce autumn storm lashed against the castle walls. Thunder shook the ancient stones as if testing their resolve. Eleanor sat in her chambers, a half-finished embroidery forgotten in her lap, listening to the rain's furious percussion. The tempest outside matched her internal turmoil, a restless energy that demanded release. After weeks of gathering fragments of the king's past like precious stones, each one examined, turned over, studied for meaning, she had finally assembled enough to act. Tonight, she would confront him. The thought sent a tremor through her hands, but she steadied them against the rich fabric of her gown. No more waiting, no more wondering. Eleanor dismissed her ladies early, claiming fatigue from the oppressive weather. Once alone, she changed from her formal attire into a simpler dress of deep blue wool. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall in waves down her back. Not a queen seeking audience, but a woman demanding truth. Finding the king proved more difficult than anticipated. He was not in his study, nor in the council chambers. The great hall stood empty save for servants preparing for tomorrow's meals. Finally, a young page mentioned seeing His Majesty heading toward the old armory some time ago. The armory occupied the oldest section of the castle, with thick walls that kept it cool even in summer. Now, with autumn's chill settling into the stones, the air felt damp and heavy as Eleanor descended the narrow staircase, a single torch lighting her way. At first, she thought the vast room empty. Shadows danced across racks of spears and swords, shields bearing the royal crest, suits of armor standing like silent sentinels. Then she saw him, a solitary figure by the far wall, his back to her, examining a battered sword displayed on simple wooden brackets. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped forward, her footfalls echoing in the cavernous space. The king turned sharply at the sound, his hand instinctively moving to his own sword before recognition dawned in his eyes. "My queen," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "What brings you to this place at such an hour?" Eleanor took a deep breath, summoning her courage. "You do, Your Majesty." His expression shifted, wariness replacing surprise. "I don't understand." "Neither do I," she replied, taking another step forward. "I don't understand why my husband cannot look me in the eyes. I don't understand why he visits the chapel each night to pray for forgiveness. I don't understand the vow that keeps him from his marriage bed." The king's face paled, his fingers tightening around the hilt of the sword at his side. "You've been listening to castle gossip." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I've been watching, listening, learning. not to gossip, but to fragments of truth that no one has bothered to piece together for me. She gestured to the space between them. This silence, it's a cruelty neither of us deserves. A flash of lightning illuminated the high windows, casting harsh light across his face, revealing emotions he usually kept hidden: pain, guilt, and something that might have been longing. The subsequent thunder seemed to shake loose his rigid composure. "Some truths are better left buried," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Not when they stand between us," Eleanor countered. "Not when they force us both to live half-lives, bearing whispers and speculation rather than honest pain." The king turned away, facing the ancient sword once more. "What would you have me say? That I have failed you? That is evident enough. I would have you say why." Eleanor closed the distance between them, close enough now to see the tension in his shoulders, to smell the leather of his tunic and the faint scent of pine that always seemed to accompany him. "Not for the court's sake, but for mine. For yours." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the storm's rage outside. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, edged with a rawness she had never heard before. "Do you know what this sword represents?" he asked, not looking at her. Eleanor studied the weapon, plain in design, its leather grip worn smooth by use, its blade notched in several places. "It seems to have seen many battles." "One battle," he corrected. "The Northern Campaign 5 years ago." His fingers hovered near the blade, not quite touching it. "I led our forces against raiders who had been terrorizing villages along the border. We were victorious, and the court celebrated me as a hero." He turned to face her, his eyes dark with memories. "But I was no hero. I arrived too late to save one village. The raiders had already—" He faltered. The destruction was complete. Among the dead was a woman, young, brave. She had organized the village's defense, given others time to escape. When we found her, she was still alive. Barely. Eleanor's throat tightened as understanding began to dawn. "What happened?" "She recognized me, though we had never met, called me by title." His voice grew distant, as if seeing that moment again. "With her dying breath, she made me swear an oath, that I would protect her people, bring the leader of the raiders to justice, and—" He hesitated. "And," Eleanor prompted gently. "And that I would not know the pleasure of a marriage bed until I had fulfilled her justice." His eyes met Eleanor's directly for the first time. "I swore it, my hand in hers, her blood sealing the vow." The armory fell silent save for the muffled sounds of the storm. Eleanor processed his words, feeling pieces fall into place. "You've honored that vow all these years," she said softly, "even when political necessity forced you to marry." "The northern leader escaped during the battle," the king explained, his voice hollow with failure. "He vanished across the sea. For 5 years I've hunted him, sent spies to every neighboring kingdom, but he remains elusive. And until you find him, until he faces justice for his crimes, I remain bound by my oath." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration so human it made Eleanor's heart ache. "I should have told you before the wedding. It was cowardly not to. But the council pressed for the alliance, and I—" He exhaled sharply. "I have no right to ask your forgiveness." Eleanor studied him in the flickering torchlight. Not the distant monarch the court knew, but a man haunted by a promise he couldn't fulfill, yet wouldn't abandon. Understanding flooded through her, washing away weeks of hurt and confusion. "It wasn't rejection," she said, the realization warming her voice. "It was honor." Something shifted in his expression. Relief, perhaps, at being understood at last. For a moment they stood in perfect comprehension of each other, the distance between them both unbridged and somehow narrower than before. "What was her name?" Eleanor asked. "The woman who extracted this vow?" The king's eyes clouded with memory. "Ilara. Her name was Ilara." Outside, the storm began to abate, the space between thunderclaps growing longer, the rain softening from rage to rhythm. "I cannot release you from your vow," Eleanor said finally. "Nor would I ask you to forsake it, but I ask this. No more silence between us, no more secrets. We may not share a marriage bed, but we share a kingdom, a future. She offered her hand, palm upward. "And perhaps in time we might share our burdens as well." The king looked at her outstretched hand, then at her face, searching for something: mockery, resentment, disappointment. Finding none, he slowly reached out and placed his hand in hers. The contact was brief but warm, a first bridge across the chasm. "Thank you," he said simply. As they left the armory together, walking side by side through torch-lit corridors, neither spoke further. Yet something fundamental had changed. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a shared breath, the first tender seedling of understanding, taking root in soil watered by truth. Winter descended upon the kingdom like a silent predator, wrapping the castle in a shroud of white and silver. 2 months had passed since Eleanor's confrontation with the king in the armory, and while the physical distance between them remained, a fragile understanding had blossomed. They spoke more freely now, about matters of state, daily concerns, even occasional personal reflections, though never again of the vow that kept them apart. Court gossip had evolved with this new development. The whispers took on different tones, spun different tales. "She's barren, poor creature," some said behind jeweled fans. "That's why he keeps his distance." "I heard he has a secret lover in the southern province," others countered. "Visits her whenever he claims to be hunting. Perhaps it's a political arrangement only, to be dissolved once he secures the Eastern alliance," the more calculating courtiers suggested. These rumors swirled around Eleanor like snowflakes, each one melting away as it touched her newfound inner strength. She had survived the worst already: the shock of rejection, the public humiliation, the private grief. Now, armed with understanding, the whispers seemed almost trivial. On this particular evening, Eleanor sat by the fire in her chambers, reviewing petitions from the northern provinces. Since her conversation with the king, he had begun including her in matters of governance, recognizing her sharp mind and natural diplomacy. This small trust meant more to her than any physical affection might have. A knock at her door announced Lady Matilda, who entered with a steaming cup of spiced wine and a troubled expression. "Your Majesty," she said, placing the cup on the table beside Eleanor. "I hesitate to bring gossip to your ears, but there's a new rumor spreading that I believe you should know of." Eleanor set aside the parchments. "What is it, Matilda?" The older woman clasped her hands tightly. "They're saying the king visits the chapel each night not for prayer but to meet with a woman in secret, the ghost of his true love who died before he could marry her." Despite herself, Eleanor felt a flicker of unease. The story was absurd, of course, but it contained just enough fragments of truth to unsettle her. Ilara, the dying woman who had extracted the king's vow, transformed by gossip into a spectral lover. "There's more," Matilda continued reluctantly. "Some say he wears a lock of her hair against his heart, and that's why he cannot bear to be with you, because his heart belongs to the dead." Eleanor rose from her chair and walked to the window, watching snow drift past like fragments of lost time. "Thank you for telling me, Matilda. It's better I hear these tales from a friend than overhear them by chance." After her lady departed, Eleanor remained at the window, troubled not by the gossip itself, but by the realization that she still knew so little of the king's heart. The vow explained his actions, but not his feelings. Was there truth hidden within the ridiculous rumors? Did he indeed harbor love for the woman who had died, Ilara, whose justice he had sworn to secure? The question gnawed at her through the night and into the following day. By afternoon, when heavy clouds threatened another snowfall, Eleanor found herself walking purposefully toward the royal chapel. In daylight, it stood empty, sunlight filtering through stained glass to cast colored shadows across stone floors and wooden pews. She moved slowly through the space, imagining the king kneeling here night after night, year after year. What thoughts filled his mind during those vigils? What prayers formed on his lips? Near the altar, something caught her eye. A small alcove partially hidden behind a tapestry depicting the kingdom's patron saint. Curious, Eleanor pushed the heavy fabric aside to reveal a simple wooden shrine. Upon it sat a single item, a leather-bound journal, its cover worn from handling. Her heart quickened. She knew she should replace the tapestry, walk away, respect whatever private devotion this represented. Yet her hand reached forward of its own accord, fingers brushing the worn leather before gently lifting the cover. Inside, in a firm, masculine hand she recognized as the king's, were entries spanning years. Not a personal journal as she had first thought, but a record, dates, locations, reports from spies and scouts, all focused on one purpose: tracking the elusive northern raider who had escaped justice. Eleanor's breath caught as she turned the pages, witnessing the king's relentless pursuit. Some entries were brief: false lead in Westmark, informant mistaken or lying. Others more detailed: reported in Blackwater Harbor, sailed east before my men arrived, 3 days behind now. The final entry, dated just 1 week prior, read simply, sighting confirmed in Ravensport. He travels under the name Caldwell. Sending trusted men. Eleanor closed the journal, carefully returning it to its exact position. This was no shrine to a lost love, but an altar to justice delayed, a physical manifestation of the vow that governed their lives. As she slipped from the chapel, her mind raced. Ravensport was a 5-day ride from the castle, a major trading hub where a man might easily disappear again. If the king's men were unsuccessful this time, the thought crystallized her purpose. With quick steps, Eleanor made her way to the castle library, where ancient maps lined the walls and filled cedar chests. The elderly librarian bowed as she entered. "Your Majesty, how may I serve you?" "I need information about Ravensport," Eleanor replied. "Trade routes, common lodgings, shipyards, anything that might help locate a man trying to remain hidden." If the librarian found her request unusual, he gave no sign. "Certainly, Your Majesty. We have several detailed accounts, including a merchant's guide written just 3 years ago." For hours, Eleanor pored over maps and documents, making careful notes. Ravensport had 4 main districts, 12 taverns frequented by sailors and merchants, 3 shipyards where a man might seek passage to foreign lands. If the northern raider truly was there, these would be his likeliest haunts. By evening, when she joined the king for the customary formal supper, Eleanor had formulated the beginnings of a plan. She watched him carefully throughout the meal, noting the new lines of tension around his mouth, the slight distraction in his gaze. He was thinking of Ravensport too, she realized, wondering if this time, finally, justice might be served. When the meal concluded and the court began to disperse, Eleanor approached him, pitching her voice low for privacy. "Might I speak with you, Your Majesty? On a matter of some importance." Surprise flickered across his features, but he nodded. "Of course. My study, perhaps." They walked in silence through corridors lit by torches fighting the early winter darkness. Behind closed doors, with only crackling firelight for company, Eleanor gathered her courage. "I know about Ravensport," she said simply. The king stiffened, wariness replacing his usual composure. "What do you mean?" "I found your journal in the chapel. I know the northern raider has been seen there." She raised a hand as he began to speak. "Before you admonish me for prying, consider this. 2 heads may prove better than 1 in solving a puzzle 5 years unsolved." For a long moment he merely stared at her, conflict evident in his gaze. Finally he sighed, the sound carrying the weight of years of frustration. "It may come to nothing, like every other lead these past 5 years. My men will search, but Ravensport is vast, and he has evaded capture for so long." "Because he knows you're hunting him," Eleanor said. "He watches for soldiers, for men asking questions, but he would not watch for a woman." The king's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "Let me go to Ravensport. Not as queen, but as a merchant's widow seeking investment opportunities. I've studied the city's layout, its taverns and shipyards. I could search places your soldiers cannot access without raising alarm." "Absolutely not," he said sharply. "It's too dangerous. If he recognized you—" "He wouldn't," Eleanor countered. "He's never seen me. And I grew up among traders and craftsmen. I know how to blend among common folk in ways your men cannot." The king paced before the fire, agitation evident in every line of his body. "You ask me to risk your safety for my vow? I cannot." "Not for your vow alone," Eleanor said softly. "For justice, for Alara and her village, for the kingdom's security, and yes, for us, for the future neither of us has dared imagine might be possible. He turned to her then, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. You would do this? Knowing the danger? Knowing there's no guarantee of success? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I would, not as your subject, nor merely as your queen, but as your partner in this burden you've carried alone too long. Something shifted in his eyes. A recognition, perhaps, that in this woman he had married for political alliance, he had found something unexpected, an equal. I need to consider this carefully, he said finally. The risks, the approach. Eleanor nodded, understanding this was neither acceptance nor refusal, but the beginning of possibility. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. Eleanor. It was the first time he had used her name rather than her title. Thank you. For understanding. For offering. A pause. For seeing me as more than my crown. She smiled, a small, genuine expression that reached her eyes. Perhaps that's all either of us has truly wanted, to be seen for who we are, not the roles we play. As she walked back to her chambers through the silent castle, Eleanor felt a strange lightness, despite the weight of what she had proposed. For the first time since her wedding night, the future held not just duty and endurance, but possibility, dangerous, uncertain, yet vibrant with potential. Snow blanketed the countryside, transforming the rugged landscape into a pristine canvas of white as Eleanor's modest caravan made its slow progress toward Ravensport. 3 days had passed since she departed the castle, traveling not as a queen but as Mistress Helena, a merchant's widow from the eastern provinces seeking business opportunities. Her entourage consisted of only 4 people, 2 guards disguised as hired swords, Lady Matilda posing as her companion, and a grizzled old driver who had once been the king's most trusted spy. The king had resisted her plan for nearly 2 weeks, proposing alternatives, raising objections, even threatening to forbid her departure outright, an authority he had never before exercised over her. But Eleanor's quiet determination had eventually worn down his resistance. That, and the undeniable logic of her argument. A woman asking questions in taverns and markets would attract far less attention than the king's soldiers had for 5 fruitless years. Their final conversation before her departure replayed in Eleanor's mind as the carriage rocked over the frozen road. The king had come to her chambers as dawn broke, his face drawn with worry and a night without sleep. If you insist on this madness, take this, he had said, pressing a small dagger into her hands. The hilt was simple iron wrapped in leather, but the blade gleamed with lethal purpose. Keep it with you always. Eleanor had nodded, tucking the weapon into the folds of her plain wool gown, so different from her usual royal attire. I'll be careful. This man, the king had hesitated, conflict evident in his eyes. Derek is his true name, though he uses many others. He's dangerous not just for his skill with weapons, but for his cunning. He reads people, finds their weaknesses. His hand had lingered on hers, warm and rough-calloused. If you find him, do not approach him. Send word immediately. Now, as the spires of Ravensport appeared on the horizon, Eleanor touched the dagger hidden in her bodice, drawing strength from its solid presence. The port city sprawled across a natural harbor, its buildings climbing the surrounding hills in layers of stone and timber. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, merging with the low winter clouds to form a gray canopy over the bustling settlement. Remember your story, Lady Matilda murmured as they approached the city gates. Helena of Eastmark, widowed these 3 years, seeking investment in the wool trade. Eleanor nodded, settling deeper into the role she had crafted. She had practiced for days, adjusting her posture to appear less regal, softening her precise diction to match a merchant's daughter, even changing the way she handled objects to suggest a lifetime of practical work rather than royal leisure. The city guards barely glanced at their travel documents before waving them through. Inside Ravensport's walls, the streets teemed with life despite the bitter cold. Sailors, merchants, and laborers hurried about their business, breath fogging in the frosty air. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries mingling with the shouts of vendors and the creaking of ships' timbers from the harbor below. They took rooms at the Sailor's Rest, a respectable inn near the main marketplace, neither too fine to raise suspicions nor so rough as to invite danger. By midday, Eleanor had established her cover, making inquiries about wool merchants and shipping contracts with appropriate merchants. By evening, she began her true work. "The man I seek is a northerner," she told the innkeeper as she sat alone in the common room, nursing a mug of mulled wine. "Tall, with a scar across his jaw. Calls himself Caldwell now, I believe. He owes my late husband a considerable debt, which I intend to collect." The innkeeper, a shrewd woman with eyes that missed nothing, shrugged. "Many northerners pass through here, especially in winter when the mountain passes close. Can't say I recall this particular one." But Eleanor persisted, night after night, tavern after tavern. She cultivated the perfect blend of determination and resignation, a widow desperate enough for coin to chase a debtor, yet not so obstinate as to seem suspicious. She learned to extract information without appearing to ask for it, to listen to conversations at neighboring tables while seeming absorbed in her own meal, to encourage loose tongues with strategically placed coins and sympathetic nods. On the fifth night, in a dockside tavern called the Rusty Anchor, she finally heard a whisper of the name she sought. "Caldwell? Aye, northern fellow. Keeps to himself mostly." The tavern girl leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Comes in late, sits in the corner, watches everyone. Gives me chills if I'm honest. Always asking about ships bound for the Eastern Isles." Eleanor's heart quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "When was he here last?" "2 nights ago. Paid with foreign coin, silver from the southern kingdoms. Said he'd return when the new ships arrive. Should be tomorrow or the day after, weather permitting." That night Eleanor could barely sleep, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. After 5 years of searching, the king's quarry was within reach. She sent one of her disguised guards back to the castle with a coded message, then prepared for the final act of her charade. The following day brought heavy snowfall that blanketed Ravensport in fresh white. Perfect weather for remaining unseen, Eleanor thought as she made her way to the docks alone, against Lady Matilda's anxious objections. She had exchanged her widow's attire for the clothes of a dock worker, rough trousers beneath a heavy woolen skirt, layers of shirts and a shapeless coat that concealed both her figure and the dagger strapped to her arm. The harbor buzzed with activity despite the weather. Sailors shouted to one another as they secured lines, merchants argued over cargo fees, and gulls squabbled over discarded fish parts on the weathered piers. Eleanor moved through it all like a ghost, watching, listening, waiting. By mid-afternoon, she had positioned herself in a small tavern overlooking the eastern harbor, where 3 ships had just arrived, their decks still being cleared of snow as crews prepared to unload their cargo. And then, as the weak winter sun began its early descent, she saw him. The man matched the description in the king's journal perfectly, tall and broad-shouldered, with a jagged scar cutting across his right jaw into his neck. He moved with the confidence of a predator, eyes constantly scanning his surroundings as he approached the harbormaster's office. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her mug. This was Derek, the raider who had destroyed Alara's village, who had eluded the king for 5 years, whose existence had shaped Eleanor's marriage in ways no one could have predicted. The face from a stranger's dying curse. She watched as he conversed with the harbormaster, gesturing toward one of the newly arrived ships. A passage being booked, she guessed. An escape being planned. Again. Her instructions had been clear: locate but do not approach. Send word and wait for the king's men. Yet as she observed Derek concluding his business and heading toward a nearby alleyway, Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that waiting might mean losing him again. The king's soldiers, even riding at full speed, were still a day away at best. Before she could reconsider, Eleanor left a few coins on the table and slipped out into the snowy street. Keeping to the shadows, she followed Derek through winding alleys, past warehouses, and through a small square where children played in the snow, oblivious to the hunter and hunted in their midst. The northern raider stopped at a nondescript building, unlocking a door and disappearing inside. Eleanor paused in a recessed doorway across the narrow street, heart pounding. She had found his lodgings. Now she need only watch until the king's forces arrived. But as evening deepened into night, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold, Eleanor noticed movements that sent alarm racing through her veins. Derek emerged briefly, spoke to a boy who ran off toward the docks, then returned inside. Minutes later, the boy came back with a rough-looking sailor. More hushed conversation, more gold changing hands. They were preparing to leave. Tonight, not tomorrow. The ship would sail with the midnight tide, carrying justice beyond reach once more. Eleanor made her decision in a heartbeat. Crossing the street, she approached the building's door and knocked firmly. The dagger pressed reassuringly against her arm as she heard heavy footsteps approaching from within. The door creaked open, and Derek's scarred face appeared, suspicious eyes narrowing at the sight of a woman alone in the darkness. "What do you want?" he demanded, his northern accent thick despite his efforts to disguise it. Eleanor summoned the voice of Helena, the merchant's widow, adding a slight tremor of fear she didn't need to fake entirely. "Please, sir, the harbor master said you might have work on a ship. My husband died owing debts. I'll scrub decks, mend sails, cook, anything to get away before the creditors take everything." Derek studied her face, searching for deception. Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze, praying he wouldn't recognize signs of nobility in her bearing. After what seemed an eternity, he grunted and stepped back, allowing her entry. "No work for women on my ship," he said gruffly, "but the captain might need a cook's helper. Wait here." As he turned to fetch his cloak from a hook on the wall, Eleanor saw it, hanging on a cord around his neck, partially visible at his collar. A small iron pendant shaped like a bear, the exact token described in the King's Journal as Derek's prized possession from his homeland. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she faced Ilara's killer, the man whose actions had set in motion the vow that had defined her marriage, the man whose capture might finally free the king from his self-imposed penance. She touched the dagger hidden in her sleeve, considering and discarding the thought in an instant. She was no assassin, and justice required more than an unmarked grave. Instead, she memorized every detail of the room, noting the maps spread on the table, the packed traveling chest in the corner. Evidence, all of it, for when the king's men arrived. If they arrived in time. The single candle flickering in Derek's lodgings cast monstrous shadows across the walls as Eleanor stood motionless, acutely aware of every sound. The raiders' heavy breathing, the distant cry of gulls from the harbor, the pounding of her own heart that seemed loud enough to betray her. Every instinct screamed for her to flee, yet she remained, hands clasped before her to hide their trembling as she played the desperate widow. "Captain's a hard man," Derek muttered, shrugging on a heavy cloak lined with wolf fur. "But he might take you on if I vouch for you." His eyes, sharp as a hunting falcon's, swept over her again. "Though I wonder why a woman dressed in dock worker's clothes would need work as a cook." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her disguise, the layered clothing meant for waiting unseen in the cold, now threatened to unravel her charade. She forced a nervous laugh, the sound brittle in the tense air. "These were my husband's, all I have left. Warmer than my own clothes for winter nights." She tugged at the oversized coat, adding a hint of embarrassed pride. "I've learned to make do with less since he died." Something shifted in Derek's expression. Not softening, precisely, but a recalculation. "Wait here," he repeated, securing a knife to his belt before moving toward the door. "Touch nothing. I'll return with the captain's answer." The moment the door closed behind him, Eleanor released a shuddering breath. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more dire than the last. The ship would sail at midnight. The king's men were still at least a day's ride away. She had found Derek only to watch him slip away again, unless she acted now. Moving swiftly, she examined the maps on his table, committing details to memory: shipping routes, marked locations, potential destinations. Next, the traveling chest, locked, but a letter protruded slightly from beneath it. She carefully extracted it, eyes widening as she scanned its contents. Written in a language she didn't recognize but bearing a seal she knew well, the crest of a neighboring kingdom's duke, known for harboring criminals in exchange for their services. A patron. Derek had powerful protection waiting across the sea. The sound of approaching voices snapped her attention back to her immediate danger. She quickly replaced the letter and resumed her position by the door, the dagger in her sleeve a cold comfort against what might come next. Derek returned with a second man, shorter but broader, with a captain's swagger and eyes like chips of ice. The captain circled Eleanor slowly, assessing her as one might examine a horse for purchase. "She looks strong enough," he grunted finally. 5 silver pieces a month, no advances. You cause trouble, we leave you at the next port." "Thank you, Captain," Eleanor murmured, eyes downcast in practiced deference. "When do we sail?" "Tonight, high tide." He turned to Derek. "Finish your business here quickly. I want to clear the harbor before that storm hits." After the captain departed, Derek began gathering his remaining possessions, moving with the efficiency of a man accustomed to hasty departures. "Be at the eastern dock by the 11th bell. Ship's called the Serpent's Tooth. Don't be late." "I'll be there," Eleanor promised, inching toward the door. "I have few belongings to gather." "Wait." Derek's command froze her in place. He approached slowly, eyes narrowed in suspicion. "You never told me your name." "Helena," she replied, the lie practiced enough to come naturally now. He nodded, but something in his expression remained unconvinced. "Strange times make for strange companions, Helena. The ship sails dangerous waters. Not all who board her return." The threat hung in the air between them, naked and cold as a blade. Eleanor forced a frightened smile, embracing rather than fighting her fear. "Any fate is better than the one awaiting me here." Finally, he stepped aside, allowing her to slip through the door into the snow-covered street. 11th bell, he reminded her. Not a moment later, Eleanor walked away with measured steps, fighting the urge to run until she had turned the corner and disappeared from view. Then she gathered her skirts and raced through the winding alleys of Ravensport, snow crunching beneath her boots as she headed not toward the Sailor's Rest, but to the city gates. The King's men would not arrive in time, not with Derek sailing at midnight. She needed a different plan, a desperate gamble. At the northern gatehouse, she found what she sought, the Royal Messenger Station maintained in every major city. The night guard startled as she burst in, snow dusting her hair and shoulders. "I need your fastest rider," she demanded, dropping the pretense of Helena the widow entirely. From inside her coat, she withdrew a ring bearing the royal seal, the king's parting gift, meant for emergencies only. "By order of the Queen." The guard's eyes widened. He bowed hastily, confusion and alarm warring on his weathered face. "Your Majesty, we had no word of your presence in Ravensport." "That was intentional," Eleanor replied sharply. "Now your fastest rider and horse. The fate of the kingdom depends on it." Within minutes, a young messenger stood before her, already preparing to mount a stamping, steaming horse. Eleanor handed him a hastily written note sealed with the royal insignia. "Ride for the harbor master's tower," she instructed. "Give this only to Captain Thorne of the Royal Guard. He should be approaching the city with 20 men. Tell him the quarry sails tonight on the Serpent's Tooth Eastern Harbor at midnight." The messenger nodded, securing the message inside his leather pouch. "And if Captain Thorne has not yet reached the approach road?" Eleanor's face hardened with determination. "Then you ride until you find him, even if you kill that horse and need another. Go, now." As the messenger galloped into the snowy night, Eleanor turned back toward the city center, mind calculating times and distances. Captain Thorne might be close enough to intercept the ship, if he pushed his men to their limits, if the messenger found him quickly, if the growing storm didn't slow their progress. Too many ifs. She returned to the Sailor's Rest long enough to inform Lady Matilda of developments and change into dry clothes. Her remaining guard wanted to accompany her back to the harbor, but Eleanor refused. "One person can watch unseen," she explained, checking that the dagger was secured to her arm beneath her sleeve. "If I'm not back by dawn, assume the ship has sailed. Return to the castle and tell the king everything." Despite Matilda's tearful protests, Eleanor slipped out once more into the winter night. The snow had intensified, thick flakes swirling on bitter wind as she made her way toward the eastern harbor. The streets had emptied, most citizens seeking warmth indoors as the temperature plummeted. Only the occasional watchman's lantern broke the growing darkness. By the time she reached the docks, the 10th bell was tolling across the city. 1 hour until the Serpent's Tooth sailed. 1 hour for justice to arrive, or for Eleanor to watch it disappear over the horizon. She found a sheltered vantage point inside an empty fish seller's stall, pulling her cloak tight against the piercing cold. From here she could see the Serpent's Tooth, a sleek trading vessel with modifications that spoke of speed prioritized over cargo capacity. A ship built for running, not trading. Activity on board suggested imminent departure. Crew securing rigging, last crates being loaded, oil lamps being lit against the gathering darkness. At the foot of the gangplank stood the captain, checking names off a manifest as late-arriving crew members hurried aboard. No sign of Derek yet. The 11th bell began to toll, its somber notes barely audible over the howling wind. Eleanor stamped her feet, trying to maintain feeling in her frozen toes as she scanned the approaches to the dock. Where was he? Just as the final note of the bell faded, she saw him, a tall figure emerging from the swirling snow, traveling pack slung over one shoulder. Derek moved with the caution of a hunted man, eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. He exchanged brief words with the captain before starting up the gangplank. Desperation clutched at Eleanor's heart. No sign of Captain Thorne or the King's men. No sign of the messenger returning. Derek was about to escape, taking with him the last chance for justice, for Alara, for the village that had been destroyed, for the King's release from his vow. Without conscious decision, Eleanor found herself moving from her hiding place, pushing through snowdrifts toward the ship. She had no plan beyond delaying, creating some disturbance, some reason for the harbor master to hold the vessel until help arrived. She had nearly reached the dock when fate intervened in the form of distant hoofbeats, growing rapidly louder. Derek heard them too. He froze halfway up the gangplank, turning toward the sound with the instinct of prey sensing a predator. Around the corner of the harbor master's tower galloped 6 riders bearing the royal standard, armor gleaming dully in the ship's lantern light. Captain Thorne at the lead, sword already drawn. Behind them, more hoofbeats, the rest of the contingent arriving in waves. "In the King's name, halt!" Thorne's voice carried over the wind and waves. Chaos erupted on the dock. Sailors scattered. The ship's captain bellowed orders. And Derek, caught in the open, made his choice. He leapt from the gangplank, not toward the ship or the approaching soldiers, but directly toward Eleanor, who stood exposed and suddenly visible in her dash from the fish stall. Before she could react, his hand closed around her arm, yanking her forward as his other hand drew a wicked blade. The cold kiss of steel pressed against her throat as he backed toward the edge of the dock, using her body as a shield. "Stand back!" he shouted to the approaching soldiers. "One more step and your queen dies." The soldiers halted, weapons raised but useless, while Eleanor remained in danger. Captain Thorne dismounted slowly, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Release Her Majesty," he called. "Surrender now, and the King may show mercy." Derek's laugh was harsh against Eleanor's ear. "The King has hunted me for 5 years. There will be no mercy." The blade pressed harder, drawing a thin line of warmth that Eleanor recognized as her own blood. "Tell your men to clear the dock. I'm boarding that ship, and the Queen comes with me until I'm safely at sea." Eleanor's mind raced through options, each more desperate than the last. The dagger at her arm remained untouched. She couldn't reach it without Derek noticing. The soldiers couldn't approach without endangering her. The ship's crew watched from the rails, unwilling to involve themselves in what had become a royal matter. Then, cutting through the standoff like a knife, came a lone rider. Not in the armor of the royal guard, but in the winter furs of a traveler who had ridden hard and fast through punishing conditions. A rider whose presence on this dock, at this moment, seemed impossible. The King himself had come to Ravensport. Time seemed to crystallize into perfect stillness as snow swirled around the dock, illuminated by lantern light that caught each flake like falling stars. Eleanor felt Derek's grip tighten on her arm, his breath hot against her neck as he registered the newcomer's identity. The King dismounted with fluid grace that belied the exhaustion evident in his face. He had ridden hard, perhaps without stopping, from the moment he'd received word of Eleanor's discovery. No crown adorned his head, no royal insignia decorated his travel-worn cloak. Yet power radiated from him, commanding the space as surely as if he stood in the great hall of his castle. His eyes found Eleanor's across the distance, and in that brief connection passed a wealth of meaning, fear, determination, and something deeper that made her heart stutter despite the blade at her throat. "Derek of the Northern Isles," the King's voice cut through the howling wind, steady and clear. 5 years I've hunted you. 5 years since you and your raiders destroyed Eastfall Village." He took a measured step forward, ignoring Captain Thorne's alarmed gesture. 5 years since a dying woman made me swear an oath I could not break. Derek's laugh held no humor. So the great king keeps his promises. How noble. The knife pressed harder against Eleanor's throat, forcing her to tilt her head back. But your oath will die with your queen if you take another step. The king remained motionless, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's. You've evaded justice long enough. Release her. Face me directly. Or are you only brave enough to fight women and children, as you did at Eastfall? A low growl rumbled through Derek's chest. The taunt had struck its mark. Eleanor felt his grip shift slightly as rage temporarily overcame calculation. It was the tiniest opening, perhaps her only chance. She remembered the king's words when he had given her the dagger. A blade to the instep paralyzes momentarily. A sharp elbow to the ribs creates distance. Simple instruction for a woman who had never fought, never faced violence directly. Yet now those words blazed in her mind with crystal clarity. In one fluid movement, before thought could become hesitation, Eleanor drove her heel down with all her strength onto Derek's instep. His startled cry coincided with her elbow slamming backward into his solar plexus. His grip loosened for just an instant, enough for Eleanor to twist away, the knife slicing a shallow path across her collarbone rather than her throat. She stumbled forward as chaos erupted around her. The king's men surged forward. Derek recovered with the speed of a cornered predator, blades slashing outward to keep the soldiers at bay as he backed toward the ship. The vessel's crew, seeing royal forces closing in, began frantically casting off lines, abandoning their passenger to his fate rather than risk being implicated in his crimes. "Surrender!" Captain Thorne shouted, advancing with sword raised. But Derek had spotted another escape, a small fishing boat moored alongside the dock. With a snarl of defiance, he lunged toward it, cutting its rope with a single slash of his blade. The king moved faster than anyone could have anticipated, leaping forward to intercept the northern raider before he could reach the boat. Their bodies collided with bone-jarring force, sending both men crashing onto the ice-slick boards of the dock. The king's sword skittered away across the wooden planks as they grappled, locked in a desperate struggle at the dock's edge. "William!" Eleanor cried out, using the king's given name for the first time, fear overwhelming protocol as she saw Derek's knife flash in the lantern light. Captain Thorne lunged forward, but before he could reach them, the inevitable happened. The ice-coated wood provided no purchase. Both struggling men rolled over the dock's edge, plunging into the black waters of the harbor below. The shock of submersion in frigid water hit like 1,000 knives piercing William's skin simultaneously. The cold stole his breath, threatened to paralyze his limbs, but rage and determination burned hotter than the sea's winter chill. 5 years of searching, of living bound by an oath that had denied him the comfort of his marriage bed, of carrying the weight of a dying woman's justice, all crystallized into a single burning purpose. Beneath the churning surface, William grappled with his enemy. One hand locked around Derek's wrist, preventing the knife from finding its mark between his ribs. The other sought the raider's throat, fighting against the buoyancy of their clothes and the disorienting darkness. Salt water stung his eyes, filled his mouth when he inadvertently gasped as Derek's knee connected with his stomach. Time stretched and compressed underwater, seconds feeling like hours as their lungs burned for air. Derek's face, barely visible in the murky darkness, contorted with hatred and desperation. This man had slaughtered an entire village, had left women and children to burn in their homes, had eluded justice for 5 long years. Now he fought like a cornered animal, knowing capture meant the executioner's block. William's lungs screamed for oxygen, his limbs growing heavier with each passing moment. But as his strength began to fade, Alara's face flashed in his memory, not as he had found her, bleeding and dying among the ruins of her village, but as she must have been before, proud, fierce, protecting her people until her final breath. Her voice echoed in his mind. "Swear to me. Justice will be done." With one final desperate surge of strength, William twisted Derek's knife hand back toward its owner. There was a moment of resistance, then the sickening sensation of the blade finding flesh. Derek's body convulsed, bubbles of precious air escaping from his mouth in a silent scream. The fight left the northern raider in an instant, His body went limp in William's grasp, blood clouding the water between them. With lungs nearly bursting, William kicked upward, still clutching his enemy's body. Evidence of justice served, proof that his vow was fulfilled. They broke the surface in an explosion of gasping breath and freezing spray. Immediately, hands reached down from the dock, Captain Thorne and his men hauling them from the deadly embrace of the winter sea. William collapsed onto the wooden planks, coughing violently as seawater purged from his lungs. Beside him lay Derek, unmoving, his own blade protruding from his chest, his eyes staring sightlessly at the snow-filled sky. "William!" Eleanor was suddenly kneeling beside him, heedless of propriety or protocol, her warm hands cradling his face. "Breathe. Please breathe." He sucked in air greedily, each breath burning in his chest but sweeter than any wine he had ever tasted. Through blurred vision, he saw Eleanor's face, a small cut on her throat still seeping blood, fear and relief warring in her eyes. "It's done," he managed between ragged breaths. "Justice is done." Captain Thorne approached, standing at attention despite the tension of the moment. "The raider is dead, Your Majesty. What are your orders regarding the body?" William struggled to sit up, Eleanor's arm supporting his back. "Take it to the town square. I want witnesses to confirm his identity. Survivors from Eastfall who resettled here. They deserve to know their family's killer has faced justice at last." As soldiers wrapped Derek's body and carried it away, William turned to Eleanor, truly seeing her now, soaked from the spray of his struggle, shivering in the bitter cold, a thin line of blood across her throat and collarbone where the knife had cut her. Yet her eyes shone with a fierce light he had never witnessed before. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice hoarse. "Why did you place yourself in such danger?" Eleanor's chin lifted slightly, the same regal gesture he had observed countless times at court, yet now layered with new meaning. "For the same reason you've hunted him these 5 years. Because justice matters. Because vows should be kept." Her voice softened. "Because your burden had become mine as well." Something broke open inside William's chest, a wall he had built around his heart the day he had made his vow to Ilara, a barrier that had kept him from truly seeing the woman he had married. Eleanor had risked everything not for herself, but for justice, for his oath, for the dead who could no longer speak for themselves. With trembling fingers, still numb from the freezing water, he reached out to touch the small wound on her throat. "You were brave beyond all reason." "As were you," she replied simply. Around them, soldiers and townspeople created a flurry of activity, bringing blankets, preparing horses, securing the scene. But between William and Eleanor stretched a moment of perfect stillness and clarity. 5 years of living bound by a vow had ended not through his efforts alone, but through the courage of the woman he had married yet never truly known. "We should return to the castle," Captain Thorne interrupted gently. "Both your majesties need warmth and the physician's attention." William nodded, allowing himself to be helped to his feet. The night's events had drained him, yet he felt lighter than he had in years. As he mounted his horse, Eleanor already secured upon her own, he looked toward the horizon where the storm was beginning to break, stars appearing between parting clouds. "Ilara," he whispered, too quietly for anyone to hear. "Your justice is done. Your people are avenged." The weight of the vow lifted from his shoulders like a physical burden set down at last. "I am free." As they rode from the harbor, William found his gaze continuously drawn to Eleanor, seeing her not as the political match his advisors had arranged, but as the woman who had fought beside him, who had understood his burden without judgment, who had risked everything to help him fulfill a promise made to another. For the first time since their wedding night, William allowed himself to imagine a true future with his queen, not just as rulers bound by duty and obligation, but as partners bound by something deeper, something that had been forged in the crucible of shared purpose and danger. The oath that had kept them apart was fulfilled. The promise that might bring them together was just beginning. Eleanor and King William's journey reminds us that true love isn't always born in passion's first flame, but sometimes in the quiet understanding that grows between two souls facing adversity together. What would you have done in Eleanor's place? Would you have had the courage to seek the truth behind rejection rather than surrendering to humiliation? Would you have risked everything to help someone honor a vow made to another? Sometimes the deepest bonds form not from what we receive, but from what we're willing to sacrifice. The King's Oath and Eleanor's determination show us that honor and love aren't opposing forces. They can become the foundation of something more profound than either could be alone. Their story teaches us that patience, understanding, and brave honesty can transform even the coldest beginnings into something beautiful. If this tale of sacrifice, honor, and unexpected love touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates stories of courage and redemption. Subscribe to our channel for more compelling historical tales that illuminate the human spirit in all its complexity. After all, the most powerful stories are those that make us examine our own hearts and wonder, what vows would we keep? What truths would we seek? And what courage would we find within ourselves when faced with love's most difficult challenges?